This is the story of how a 70-year-old widow, left with nothing but a worthless patch of dirt by her cruel stepson, unearthed a secret that would not only save her but utterly destroy the man who cast her out. It began, as most tragedies do, with a knock on the door on a day when the sky was already weeping. The rain came down in cold, relentless sheets, mirroring the chill that had long ago settled in Margaret's heart whenever she thought of Richard. He stood on her porch, not as a son, but as a predator. His fine wool suit, dark as a raven's wing, shed the water with contemptuous ease, a stark contrast to the worn, welcoming wood of the porch Thomas, her late husband, had built with his own hands. At his side, her golden retriever, Rusty, let out a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of pure animal intuition. Richard's gaze flickered to the dog, a sneer twisting his lips. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, protected by a leather folio. It was a weapon, and he wielded it with the casual cruelty of a man who had never known a day of want or a moment of doubt. "Margaret," he said, the name a cold, flat stone in the air between them. He didn't call her mother, he never had. It's time he didn't need to elaborate. For weeks, his letters had arrived, each one colder and more demanding than the last, penned by a lawyer whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency. They spoke of probate, of assets, of the orderly transfer of property. They were sterile, legal words for the act of tearing a life apart. Margaret simply nodded, her small frame wrapped in a shawl that had been her mother's. She didn't invite him in. He wouldn't have come in anyway. The house, filled with the scent of old books, drying herbs, and a lifetime of memories with Thomas, was anathema to him. He was a man of sharp angles, new leather, and the metallic tang of money. The papers he extended were an eviction notice. A final, formal declaration that her existence in this place, the only home she had known for 40 years, was now an inconvenience to his inheritance. Her hand trembled as she took them. The paper was crisp, expensive, and felt like ice against her skin. "According to the will, the house and the main ranch holdings are mine," he stated, his voice devoid of any emotion save a barely concealed impatience. "Father was sentimental. He left you a small parcel of land." A gesture, I suppose. He gestured vaguely towards the distant, forbidding mesas. "The deed is with the lawyer. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises, 48 hours. 2 sunrises. 2 sunsets. To dismantle a life. To pack away the ghosts of laughter and the echoes of love that resided in every corner, every worn floorboard, every pane of glass that looked out onto the valley Thomas had loved so fiercely." Rusty pressed against her leg, a warm, solid presence in a world that was rapidly dissolving into a cold, legal mist. Margaret looked past her stepson, at the rain blurring the landscape into a watercolor of grief. She could feel Thomas's absence like a physical wound, a hollow space beside her where his strength used to be. She had always known Richard resented her, saw her as the woman who had taken his mother's place, but she had never imagined the sheer, bottomless depth of his coldness. He was not just taking a house, he was erasing her, scrubbing her from the legacy of the man they had both, in their own ways, loved. He was claiming everything, and leaving her with what he considered nothing. A final, insulting crumb from the feast of his inheritance. 2 days later, the morning sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the dusty main street as Margaret walked toward the lawyer's office. The air was cold and brittle, each breath a small, white cloud before her face. Rusty trotted faithfully at her heels, his head low, sensing the gravity of the moment. The office of Mr. Abernathy was exactly as one might imagine, dark wood, shelves groaning with the weight of thick, leather-bound books, and the faint, cloying scent of stale cigar smoke and ink. It was a place where lives were dissected and rearranged on paper, fortunes won and lost with the scratch of a pen. Richard was already there, seated in a large leather chair as if it were a throne. He was examining his gold pocket watch, the rhythmic ticking a stark counterpoint to the frantic beating of Margaret's heart. He didn't look up when she entered. He simply snapped the watch shut with a decisive click and placed it back in his waistcoat pocket. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of neutral disinterest, gestured for her to sit. The chair was hard and unwelcoming. "Mrs. Vance," the lawyer began, his voice a dry rustle of paper. We are here to finalize the execution of your late husband's estate. As you know, the primary assets, including the main ranch house and the associated livestock and grazing lands, passed to his son, Richard. He pushed a stack of documents across the polished surface of the desk. These require your signature, acknowledging the transfer and waiving any further claims. Margaret looked at the papers, at the dense blocks of text and the stark, empty lines waiting for her name. It felt like a final betrayal of Thomas, to sign away the life they had built. But the law was the law, and Richard had it all on his side. Richard finally spoke, his voice dripping with condescension. It's a simple formality, Margaret. A matter of tidying things up. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, a predator closing in. Father was a good man, but not always a practical one. This ranch needs a firm hand, someone to guide it into the future, not someone to let it decay into a memorial. The insult was clear. He saw her as a relic, a dusty antique to be cleared out with the rest of the old furniture. She refused to meet his gaze, focusing instead on the lawyer's impassive face. "And my inheritance?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. A cruel smile played on Richard's lips. Mr. Abernathy slid a single, separate document toward her. It was a deed. "Thomas left you the parcel of land known as Stony Creek Hollow," the lawyer said, his tone unchanging. "Approximately 10 acres, bordering the old collapsed quarry." Richard chuckled, a short, ugly sound. "My kingdom of dust," he drawled, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. "Father bought it for a song decades ago. They say the soil is too alkaline to grow anything but scrub brush and regret. There's an old cave dwelling on the property, I believe. Barely fit for a coyote." He looked directly at her then, his eyes glinting with malice. "But it's yours. Free and clear. A place to live out your golden years in quiet contemplation." The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across her cheeks. He wasn't just evicting her, he was banishing her to a wasteland. With trembling hands, Margaret picked up the pen. The ink flowed, black and final. She signed her name, her life, away. As she pushed the papers back, her gaze fell on the deed to Stony Creek Hollow. It was all she had left of Thomas. A barren field. A broken-down cave. And a dog. The day of the eviction was a public spectacle of cruelty. The sky was a bruised, unforgiving grey, spitting a mixture of sleet and freezing rain that clung to every surface. Richard stood on the porch, arms crossed over the chest of his impeccably tailored greatcoat, overseeing the proceedings like a conquering general. He had not hired proper movers. Instead, he'd paid 2 rough-looking men from the saloon, men who handled Margaret's meager possessions with careless disdain. A rocking chair Thomas had made for her was tossed into the back of a small, rickety cart, one of its rockers cracking with a sound that echoed the breaking of her own heart. A box of books, her only real treasures, was dropped, spilling its contents onto the muddy ground. Richard didn't flinch. He simply watched, his expression one of bored satisfaction. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. Richard was the new power in the valley, the owner of the largest ranch, the man who controlled the water rights and held the bank's biggest loans. To cross him was to invite ruin, so they stayed silent, their sympathy a useless, invisible shield. Margaret moved through the house one last time, a ghost in her own home. She ran her hand along the cool, smooth wood of the mantelpiece, touched the floral pattern on the worn armchair where Thomas used to sit and read, and looked out the window at the garden she had tended for 40 years. Each object screamed a memory, a shared laugh, a quiet moment of comfort. Now, they were just things, property of a man who saw them only in terms of their monetary value. When she finally stepped outside, pulling her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, Richard blocked her path. He held up a small, silver locket. It was hers. It had fallen from her neck during the chaos. Forgetting something, he asked, dangling it from his fingers. Inside were 2 tiny, faded portraits, one of her as a young woman, the other of Thomas. He opened it, glanced at the images with a dismissive curl of his lip, and then, instead of handing it to her, he tossed it into the mud at her feet. "Don't want you leaving any clutter behind," he said coolly. The act was so petty, so needlessly cruel, that it stole the breath from her lungs. Rusty, who had been growling at the removal men, now bared his teeth at Richard, a deep, menacing rumble in his chest. Richard kicked a clod of dirt in the dog's direction. "And take that flea-bitten mutt with you. It stinks up the place." Margaret knelt, her old bones protesting, and retrieved the locket from the cold, wet earth. She wiped it clean on her dress and clutched it in her fist, the metal a small, cold comfort. She didn't say a word. There were no words left. Her dignity was the only thing he couldn't take, and she would not give it to him by descending to his level. She walked to the small cart, her back straight, her head held high. One of the men had crudely hitched her old mare, Daisy, to the front. It was a pathetic caravan of sorrow. As she climbed onto the wooden seat, the freezing rain intensified, plastering her grey hair to her scalp. Richard watched her go, a silhouette of triumph in the doorway of the home she had loved. He did not wave. He did not offer a single word of parting. He simply closed the heavy oak door with a solid, final thud, shutting her out of his world forever. The sound echoed across the yard, a punctuation mark at the end of a life. The journey to Stony Creek Hollow was long and arduous. The path was little more than a set of muddy ruts that wound its way out of the fertile valley and up into the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the high chaparral. The wind howled, a mournful sound that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the world. Margaret, her hands raw and chapped from gripping the reins, guided the tired mare onward, with Rusty trotting beside the cart, his golden coat matted with mud. When they finally arrived, the sun was a weak, watery disk sinking behind the jagged mesas. Richard had not exaggerated. The land was a desolate expanse of packed, cracked earth, sharp rocks, and thorny scrub brush. It was a place where life struggled, where every drop of water was a precious jewel. And there, carved into the base of a sheer rock face, was the cave. It was more of a deep, gaping wound in the stone than a dwelling. The entrance was partially blocked by a rockfall from years past, and the interior was dark, damp, and smelled of neglect and wild animals. This was her inheritance. Her kingdom of dust. The first few days were a blur of sheer survival. Margaret, driven by a will she didn't know she possessed, began the Sisyphean task of making the cave habitable. She used a broken shovel left in the cart to clear the fallen rocks from the entrance. Her muscles screamed in protest, and her back ached with a fire she had never known, but she persisted. Inside, she swept out decades of accumulated dirt, leaves, and animal droppings. She discovered a small, steady trickle of clean water seeping from a fissure in the back wall, a tiny miracle that felt like a gift from the earth itself. She and Rusty huddled together for warmth at night, the dog's solid, breathing body a comfort against the profound, terrifying loneliness of the wilderness. As weeks turned into a month, a rhythm began to form. Margaret proved to be more resilient than anyone, including herself, could have imagined. She used old canvas from the cart to create a flap over the entrance, blocking the worst of the wind. She found a flat, stable area for a fire pit and learned which types of wood burned slow and hot. Her days were spent foraging. She discovered patches of hardy yucca whose roots, when roasted, were surprisingly nourishing. She found wild onions and bitter greens growing in the shelter of rocks. Rusty, for his part, became a hunter. He would return to the cave with a rabbit or a prairie dog, laying his prize at her feet with a proud wag of his tail. They were a team, a small, two-soul pack against the vast indifference of the landscape. The seasons turned. The harsh cold of winter gave way to a brief, vibrant spring where unexpected wildflowers bloomed in defiance of the poor soil. The brutal heat of summer baked the land, forcing them to spend the hottest part of the day in the cool, dark depths of the cave. She grew thinner, her skin weathered and tanned by the sun and wind, but her eyes held a new clarity. The grief was still there, a constant, dull ache, but it was now overlaid with a gritty, hard-won strength. She was no longer just a widow, she was a survivor. She had been cast out, left to perish, but she had refused. In this desolate, forgotten corner of the world, she was, against all odds, still here. And she was not yet done. One sweltering afternoon, as Margaret was gathering firewood near the edge of her property, a figure appeared on the horizon. It was a man, old and wiry, leading a pack mule laden with prospecting gear. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who knew the land and respected its harshness. Rusty, ever vigilant, let out a series of sharp barks, standing protectively in front of Margaret. The man stopped, holding up a hand in a gesture of peace. He had a grizzled white beard, a face like a topographical map of a long, hard life, and eyes the color of the pale desert sky. "Easy there, fella," he called out, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Just passing through. Didn't figure anyone lived out this way," and Margaret quieted Rusty with a gentle hand on his head. "I live here," she said, her voice steady. The man squinted, taking in the scene, the small, neat stack of firewood, the wisp of smoke rising from the cave entrance, and the old woman with the spine of steel standing before him. He tipped his dusty hat. "Name Samuel. Been working a small claim a few miles north of here for goings on 20 years. Never seen a soul set up camp in the old quarry cave." He looked her over, his gaze not unkind. He saw the worn dress, the calloused hands, the deep lines of sorrow and determination etched on her face. He didn't ask how she came to be here, the story was plain enough for anyone with eyes to see. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of her struggle. "Well, I'll be," he said, more to himself than to her. A few days later, Samuel returned. He didn't announce himself, just appeared at the mouth of the cave as she was mending a tear in her shawl. He held out a heavy burlap sack. "Figured you could use this," he grunted, setting it down. Inside was a 50-pound sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, a small tin of coffee, and a bag of beans. It was a fortune. "I can't pay you for this," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel just shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "Ain't asking her for payment. It's a hard country out here. Folks gotta look out for each other. Besides," he added, with a slight grin, "my mule was complainin' about the load." He stayed for a cup of the coffee she brewed over her small fire. He didn't pry or offer pity, which she was grateful for. He simply talked about the land, the way the seasons changed, the signs of a coming storm. As he was leaving, he paused and looked at the back wall of the cave, where her small spring trickled down. "Funny thing about this rock formation," he mused, tapping a section with his knuckles. It produced a dull, hollow thud. "Sounds different right there. Probably just a fissure, but you never know with this limestone. It's full of surprises." His observation was casual, an idle thought from a man who spent his life reading the secrets of the earth. But for Margaret, it planted a seed of curiosity. A hollow sound. A surprise in the stone. It was a small, insignificant detail, but in a life that had been stripped down to its barest essentials, even the smallest mystery held a powerful allure. She had an ally now, a witness to her existence. She was no longer entirely alone. The hollow sound Samuel had noticed lingered in Margaret's mind. It became a quiet obsession during the long, silent hours in the cave. She would run her hands over the cool, damp stone at the back, feeling for any irregularity, any seam or crack that might explain the difference in resonance. It was during one of these explorations, while cleaning a dusty, forgotten corner near the back wall, that her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic, wedged deep beneath a rocky outcrop. With a surge of effort, she pried away the loose stones. There, half buried in the packed earth, was an old iron chest. It was about 2 feet long and a foot high, bound with thick, rusted straps and fitted with a heavy, complex lock. It was Thomas's. She recognized it instantly. Years ago, he had spent a few weeks in his workshop, hammering and fitting pieces for this very chest. He had been secretive about it, saying only that it was for safekeeping. She had assumed it was for important ranch documents and had thought nothing more of it when it disappeared from the workshop. He must have brought it out here and hidden it. Why? The chest was incredibly heavy, fused to the ground by time and dampness. She couldn't budge it on her own. When Samuel next visited, she showed it to him. His eyes widened with a prospector's gleam. "Well now," he said, running a hand over the rusted metal. "That ain't no ordinary strongbox. That's built to last together." They tried to force the lock with a crowbar, but the old iron held firm. They tried to break the hinges, but they were forged with a skill that defied their efforts. The chest remained stubbornly, infuriatingly sealed. Margaret could hear a faint rattling sound inside when they jostled it, not the clink of coins, but the soft, muffled sound of paper and perhaps a smaller metal object. The chest's presence changed the atmosphere of the cave. It was a tangible link to her past, a final, unanswered question from her husband. Its location, tucked away at the very back of this specific cave on this specific piece of worthless land, felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. Her mind kept returning to Thomas's last few months. He had grown quiet, contemplative. He spent long hours poring over old maps and geological surveys, things she had assumed were related to managing the ranch's water sources. He had seemed worried, not about his health, but about the future. He had looked at Richard with a deep, unspoken sadness in his eyes. He must have known. He must have seen the avarice growing in his son's heart like a poison weed. He couldn't change his will. She recalled him mentioning once that the original deed from his own father had come with complex succession clauses, but he was not a man to be so easily defeated. He was a planner, a man who thought 10 steps ahead. This chest, this cave, this barren field, it was all part of something. A plan she didn't yet understand. The key, she thought, must be the key. Not just the physical key to the chest, but the key to understanding his final actions. The mystery of it gave her a new purpose, a focus beyond mere survival. The grief for her husband was now mingled with a profound sense of curiosity and a dawning, incredible hope. Thomas had not abandoned her. He had left her a puzzle. And she was determined to solve it. The convergence of clues, the hollow-sounding wall, the reappearance of the iron chest, and the nagging feeling of Thomas's foresight, ignited a spark of conviction in Margaret. She explained her theory to Samuel, who, being a man accustomed to chasing hunches deep into the earth, needed little convincing. A false wall, he murmured, his eyes alight with possibility. Seen it once before in an old Spanish mine. Clever way to hide the real payload. They decided to start at the spot where Rusty had taken an unusual interest. The dog, as if sensing their intent, began to dig frantically at the base of the wall near the chest, whining with excitement. "Dog knows," Samuel grunted, spitting on his hands and hefting a heavy pickaxe he'd brought from his camp. "Animals can sense things we can't." Voids in the earth, changes in pressure. The work was brutal. The limestone was dense, and their tools were simple. The rhythmic clang of the pickaxe against stone echoed through the cave, a sound of relentless determination. Margaret, using a smaller sledgehammer and a chisel, worked alongside him. Dust filled the air, coating their clothes and faces in a fine white powder. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of the light at the cave's mouth. They stopped only to drink from the spring and to eat a sparse meal of jerky and hardtack. Their muscles ached, their hands were blistered and raw, but neither suggested stopping. They were chipping away not just at a wall of rock, but at years of injustice and despair. With every swing, Margaret felt a surge of power, a reclamation of her own fate. She was no longer a passive victim of Richard's cruelty, she was an active agent in her own salvation. Finally, after nearly 2 days of grueling labor, it happened. Samuel's pickaxe struck the wall with a different sound, not a solid thunk, but a hollow crack. A web of fractures spread from the point of impact. "Stand back," he warned. He took one more mighty swing. The rock gave way with a groan, crumbling inward and revealing a dark, man-made cavity behind it. A rush of cool, still air, untouched for decades, washed over them, carrying the scent of dry earth and old metal. They peered into the darkness, their hearts pounding. It wasn't a natural cavern. The space was small, no more than 6 feet deep and 4 feet high, but its walls were unnaturally smooth. And in the center, sitting on a carefully leveled stone pedestal, was another, larger strongbox. This one was different from the iron chest. It was made of polished steel, its surface pristine, protected from the dampness of the outer cave. It was not locked with a key, but sealed with a complex-looking numerical dial. Taped firmly to the top of the strongbox was a thick, leather-bound journal, Thomas's familiar script gracing the cover with a single word, Margaret. Her hands trembled as she reached into the darkness and took the journal. It felt warm, as if it still held the heat of his hands. Samuel stood back, giving her a respectful silence. This was her moment. With Rusty pressing against her side, Margaret sat on the floor of the cave, the dust of their labor swirling in the faint light, and opened the final message from her husband. The truth was finally at hand. The ink on the first page of the journal was dark and clear, Thomas's handwriting as strong and steady as she remembered. It was not a journal, but a letter. A letter written across time, from a place of love and foresight. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then I have gone, and the worst has come to pass. I can only pray that you found your way here, and that you had the strength to look beyond the surface of things, as you always have." Margaret's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away, her focus absolute. She had to read on. "I have known for many years about the darkness in my son's heart. It is the great failure of my life that I could not temper his greed with kindness. I saw how he looked at our home, our life's work, not with pride, but with avarice. He sees only the value of things, never their worth. I am bound by my own father's will concerning the ranch, it must pass to my blood heir. It was a foolish, prideful clause, and one I could not break. But my true legacy, our sovereign treasury, I could protect. I could hide it, and I could leave it for you." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. He explained everything. Decades ago, long before he had inherited the ranch, Thomas had been a geologist. On a survey of this region, he had discovered a massive, incredibly rich lode of gold. It was not a placid deposit of loose nuggets, but a deep, solid vein of quartz shot through with pure gold, running for miles directly beneath this very patch of barren land. The old quarry cave was the weakest point in the rock, the most direct access to the top of the vein. He had bought the worthless land immediately, filing a federal mining claim under a holding company whose sole director was listed as Margaret Vance. The paperwork, he explained, was in the steel strongbox. The letter continued, detailing his plan. "The world believes this land is empty. Richard believes it is empty. It is the perfect vault. He will cast you out, my love, I know he will. And in his arrogance, he will hand you the very key to his own undoing. He will give you the deed to this land, this golden kingdom, believing he is giving you a beggar's plot. Let him. Let his greed blind him." He explained that the combination to the steel strongbox was a series of dates, their anniversary, her birthday, the day they first met. Inside, she would find the official, notarized mining claim filed in her name, the geological surveys pinpointing the richest parts of the vein, and a small, simple iron key. The key to the first chest. "The iron chest," he wrote, "contained starter funds. I sold off some remote assets years ago, telling Richard the investments had failed. The cash is in there. Enough to hire lawyers, to hire engineers, to hire security. Enough to begin. The rest, the true fortune, is beneath your feet. It is all yours, Margaret. My love, my partner, my wife. You were the true treasure of my life. Now, go and claim what is rightfully yours. Be strong. Be wise. And live well." A single tear dropped onto the page, smudging the final words, "Yours forever, Thomas." She looked up at Samuel, her eyes shining with a fierce, brilliant light. "He knew," she whispered, her voice choked with a mix of sorrow and overwhelming love. "He knew everything." Just as the monumental weight of Thomas's revelation settled over them, a new sound intruded, the distant rumble of carriage wheels and the drumming of horses' hooves, approaching at speed. Samuel scrambled to the mouth of the cave, peering out towards the dusty track. "Riders coming," he said, his voice grim. And there in a hurry, a cloud of dust on the horizon resolved into a fine, black carriage pulled by two powerful horses, with 3 men on horseback riding alongside. Margaret recognized the carriage at once. It was Richard's. A cold knot of dread and determination formed in her stomach. He had come for the land. Samuel moved to stand beside her, his hand resting on the handle of the pickaxe he still held. "Stay behind me," he growled. The carriage skidded to a halt a few yards from the cave. Richard stepped out, dressed in a sharp city suit. He was flanked by the town sheriff and 2 hired thugs whose brutish faces were set in smug sneers. Richard's eye swept over the scene, the pathetic cave dwelling, the old woman in her dusty dress, the grizzled prospector. A look of supreme triumph spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, striding forward and waving a document. "I had a feeling I'd find you squatting here. I'm afraid your tenancy is over, Margaret. It seems you've neglected to pay the property taxes," he smirked. "A foolish oversight. As the primary creditor in this county, I have purchased the debt and am now seizing the property." "It's all perfectly legal," the sheriff shifted uncomfortably but nodded in agreement. It was a classic, predatory loophole. He had come to deliver the final, crushing blow. "Get off my land," he commanded. "Now." But as he took another step forward, the thunder of more hooves filled the air. A second, heavier wagon, a government-stamped buckboard, crested the rise, pulled by 4 strong mules. It hurtled down the track and pulled up sharply behind Richard's carriage, boxing him in. 2 men in crisp, dark suits and bowler hats disembarked. They moved with an air of quiet, unshakable authority. One of them held a leather satchel. "Richard Vance?" the first agent asked, his voice sharp and official. Richard turned, startled and annoyed by the interruption. "I am." "This is a private matter." The agent ignored him and looked past him, his eyes finding Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret Vance." Margaret stepped forward from the shadows of the cave. "I am Margaret Vance," the agent nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "We're from the Territorial Mining Authority. We received a telegraph message from a Mr. Samuel Croft regarding a claim dispute." He opened his satchel and produced a thick, ribbon-bound document with a heavy wax seal. According to federal records filed 12 years ago, claim number 734, known as the Stony Creek Hollow parcel, and all mineral rights therein, belong exclusively to one Margaret Vance. The claim is in good standing, and the geological survey is fully certified. He held up the document. "This land, and everything beneath it, is hers. And any attempt to fraudulently seize a federally registered mining claim is a very serious crime." The sheriff's face went pale. The hired thugs suddenly found the tips of their boots intensely interesting. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, the worthless tax deed fluttering in his hand like a dead leaf. The world tilted on its axis for Richard. The smug certainty drained from his face, replaced by a ghastly, contorted mask of confusion, rage, and dawning horror. "What?" "That's impossible," he stammered, turning from the agents to Margaret. "This is a trick. This land is worthless. It's rock and dust." The second agent stepped forward, his expression cold as a winter morning. "Our preliminary assessment, based on the filed geological survey by Thomas Vance, suggests this land is situated over one of the richest gold lodes discovered in this territory." "It is, Mr. Vance, anything but worthless." The word struck Richard like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide, finally understanding. The worthless field. The insulting inheritance. It had all been a magnificent, perfectly executed trap laid by the father he had so smugly underestimated. He looked at Margaret, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a frail old woman, but the architect of his ruin. The pleading began then, a desperate, pathetic torrent of words. "Mother," he choked out, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Mother, you can't. We're family. There's been a misunderstanding. We can share it. I can manage it for you." "You don't understand business, the complexities." Margaret took a slow, deliberate step out of the cave, into the full light of the sun. Rusty was at her side, a silent, golden guardian. She looked at the sniveling man before her, the man who had tossed her memories in the mud, who had left her to die in a cave, and she felt nothing. Not pity, not anger, only a vast, cold emptiness where a family bond used to be. She let the silence stretch, her calm gaze stripping away his every defense. "You are correct, Richard," she said finally, her voice clear and strong. carrying across the silent tableau. After all you have done, she turned her back on him, a simple, devastating gesture of dismissal. That was all. The lead mining agent spoke again, his voice cutting through the tense air. Mr. Vance, your documented attempt to seize this property through manufactured tax delinquency constitutes conspiracy and fraud against a federal claim holder. You are under arrest. The sheriff, eager to align himself with the winning side, quickly stepped forward to clap irons on Richard's wrists. The fight went out of him completely. He slumped, a puppet with its strings cut, his expensive suit now covered in the dust of the kingdom he had so casually given away. 6 months later, the landscape of Stony Creek Hollow was transformed. A professionally managed mining operation now occupied the far end of the property, its structures neat and efficient, its work providing dozens of good-paying jobs for people in the county. On a gentle rise overlooking the valley, a new house stood, modest but comfortable, with a wide porch and large windows that let in the morning sun. Margaret sat there in a familiar rocking chair, a new one built by a grateful carpenter from town whose family now had steady work. Rusty dozed at her feet on a plush, warm rug. The mine's foreman, a respected and well-paid man named Samuel, was just leaving after giving his daily report. Margaret had used her newfound wealth not for luxury, but for life. She had funded the drilling of a new town well, ending the water shortages that had plagued the valley for years. She established a trust to care for the region's stray and abandoned animals. She was not a lady of charity, but a pillar of the community, investing in the people and the land that had, in turn, saved her. She held the old silver locket in her hand, the portraits of her and Thomas nestled safely inside. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and now bountiful land. True wealth, my love, she whispered to the wind, is not what you can take, but what you can build. Before you go, if you were moved by Margaret's story of resilience and ultimate triumph, please take a moment to hit that like button. It really helps our channel grow and bring more stories like this to you. And don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell, so you never miss a tale of karmic justice. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What was the most satisfying moment of Richard's downfall for you? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.